Valentine's planning starts now. Get ahead of the game with 1-800-Flowers XOXO sale and save 20% on gifts for the ones you love. For 50 years, 1-800-Flowers has made Valentine's special by delivering millions of high-quality roses with unmatched reliability. Right now, save 20% on premium bouquets, all backed by their 7-day freshness guarantee. This XOXO sale ends February 5th, so don't wait. Save 20% at 1-800-Flowers.com/podcast. That's 1-800-Flowers.com/podcast.
What I mean is that in order to allow happiness to come over oneself, one has to get rid of their demand that life be easy, that there be ideal circumstances in our lives, that it be fair. When we hold the attitude, when we put demands on life and say life should be fair or life should not be so hard, we are not creating the psychological environment for happiness to evolve.
Hello, everyone. I'm Larry Weeks. Welcome to the Bounce Podcast. You know, fixing where we can things in our external world can certainly provide genuine relief and satisfaction. But it fails as a strategy for lasting peace when our internal well-being becomes conditional on things we cannot fully control, like getting people to behave, getting life to cooperate, dealing with uncertainty. So the most direct path to relief from such crazy-making is learning to challenge the demands we quietly place on things in our external reality. My guest today is Dr. Walter Matweychuk. He's a clinical psychologist who is trained in the lineage of modern cognitive therapy in a way that very few have. He's worked with Albert Ellis, the founder of Rational Emotive Behavior Therapy, REBT, and he has worked closely with Beck, the father of cognitive behavioral therapy. Today, he practices and trains clinicians in both REBT, CBT through the University of Pennsylvania's Perelman School of Medicine, and also teaches CBT at NYU. And in this conversation, Dr. Matweychuk, who I will affectionately call Walter because, number one, that's his name. Number two, it's the name of my late brother, Walter, makes the case for REBT as more than a therapy model, but as a practical philosophy for living. Now, you will hear us discuss ideas very similar to Stoicism, and rightly so, as there is an acknowledged line of influence from Stoicism. Albert Ellis explicitly credited the ancient Stoic philosophers as the philosophical precursors to his approach. So this is a deep dive into REBT, and we discuss everything from unconditional self-acceptance, why you don't need approval to be okay, to the core irrational demands that quietly drive stress and anxiety in our lives, along with the problem of human value rating and why shame often backfires, what it was like training with Albert Ellis, how to practice life acceptance when reality blows up your plan, and how to find direction when you honestly don't know what to do with your life. Stress is often a demand in disguise, and this episode can hopefully help you spot it and give you a few tools to loosen its grip. So now I give you Dr. Walter Matweychuk. Thank you so much for coming on. I took a deep breath. I'm centered. I'm settled in. We're going to have a good chat about REBT. So out of the gate, I just want to ask you, because I didn't see all of it, but there's a YouTube video of you. Are you in New York, by the way?
Yes, I am here in Manhattan, a couple blocks south of Grand Central Station.
I want to say Washington Park. I don't know where you were, but you had a sign. You were in the middle of the park. Strangers were walking by and you held up. I didn't see what the sign said on it, but I think you said something like, it's my birthday today. And you're trying to push against ageism or something. I don't know, but you sang happy birthday to yourself in the middle of this park. Tell me, that was very entertaining, but tell me, what was the goal? Were you trying, was it a form of exposure therapy or something, or what, was it just protest?
No. I think the goal was twofold. One, to model for people unconditional self-acceptance, and two, to do what's called the shame attack. So in Rational Emotive Behavior Therapy, we see shame as an unhealthy negative emotion. And it emanates from an attitude that I need the approval of significant others. And if they look down upon me, then I'm lesser of a person. So what I was doing on my 65th birthday, and you're right, it was Washington Square Park, down where in New York City. I had a big sign that said, happy birthday to me. Today I'm 65 or something like that. I think it said, I'm 65. And so I announced to everyone that I was 65. And then I sang happy birthday to me. And there happened to be a jazz band right there. So I had, when they stopped playing, I jumped up on the...
Talk to them first. You just jumped up.
No. And I just jumped up and started announcing that it was my birthday and that I was 65 and I was single-handedly taking on the forces of ageism and started singing happy birthday. Some people joined me. They started playing. And then at the end, I gave my signature do, 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 do to end it. And that every birthday I do a shame attack. So I've twisted in Central Park to Chubby Checkers. I've sang in Italy and France, different songs like rational emotive songs that poke fun at irrational ideas. So I concoct some shame attack to do on my birthday. I once got a ride in a Rolls Royce in Paris the day before my birthday. I asked a man who had a Rolls Royce to give me a ride, and he gave me one, much to my delight and surprise. So that the rules in REBT are nothing dangerous, nothing illegal, and nothing that will endanger other people or yourself, or really even embarrass other people. We don't want to use them to promote our flourishing. My wife, she often finds my antics in public a little bit uncomfortable, but she goes along with it. She's a good soul.
Yeah, she's a good soul. But are there other videos like that of yours? Because if there are, I'm going to start looking. Okay, good. I want to see.
Yeah, so, Paris.
That's great. I love that video, and I love that kind of stuff. You mentioned shame. I'm running ahead of myself. I'm going to back up in a minute. So I do have a train of thought. But you said, or you're trying to make a point that shame is bad? Sorry.
Yeah. Yes.
Okay. Can I challenge you on that in this
Please.
sense? So part of me thought that at some level, and I'm thinking on a continuum, on some level, shame is good because it's like a preventative. This is a society of not just me, it's other people here. So they're going to give me feedback on my behavior, and I may feel either shame or guilt or something else from it. So I do understand the problem with rumination, excessive guilt, or being shameful over ridiculous things. So I wanted to frame that way. There's no use for it whatsoever.
There is use for awareness of the consequences of your behavior, responsibility for your behavior. So, for example, we make a distinction between healthy negative emotions that are a result of not getting our desires fulfilled, and unhealthy negative emotions that result from not getting our desires fulfilled. And life is really complex because some of our desires compete for their place on the hierarchy. And so what we're saying in REBT is that shame is a function of saying, I need the love and approval of significant others, and I may sacrifice what I want in order to get that approval.
I guess I really never thought through my definition of shame, but that certainly sounds different than some concept I had. Sorry, go ahead.
And so if in pursuit of my goals, I inhibit myself because I'm afraid that you may disapprove of me, well, then I'm responsible for that decision and I might not get what I want. On the other hand, if I elect to not yield to your approval and say, look, I'll accept myself, I don't need this man's approval, I'm responsible for the action that I may do and the consequences, the social consequences of that. So I will factor in the consequences of my shameless behavior. And the healthy negative emotion I'll have is concern, or if in fact that shame is an emotion that we often feel when we fall short in a public setting. We fall short of some standard that we have, and that in falling short of the standard, we then not only acknowledge that other people have seen us fall short, but then we down ourselves. Like not only did I do a shameful thing that other people may not agree with, but I'm also a shameful person. And REBT would argue that even if you did something that was shameful, it doesn't make you a shameful person. It makes you a person who did something that was not well received in your society. Now, when we do things in our society that are not well received, there are consequences. And we had better be concerned, which is another healthy emotion, about those consequences. So there's your social governor, the concern, the cost that we will face. And we have to do a hedonic calculus to see whether or not it's in our best interest, whether it's important enough. We pick our battles, so to speak. And sometimes we go, well, it's not important enough for me to pursue what I want because the social costs outweigh the potential benefits given my values hierarchy. But when the social costs don't outweigh the potential benefits, I might say to myself, well, so what if some people don't like what I'm saying? I'm going to speak my mind and shamelessly go about my business. So think about, like, for example, a person in a meeting, a professional meeting. They may have a thought that they think is potentially a thought that could be either viewed by the group as disapproving or the people in power as disapproving. But on the other hand, there may be an advantage to speaking. I saw a Wall Street Journal, the article the other day that said the boss, supervisor, the lead person should speak last in a meeting, not first. I think in order to encourage people to shamelessly speak, I didn't read the article, but I gathered, I wanted to, that the idea was if the person with the most power in the room speaks first, he will inhibit creativity coming forth.
Sounds right.
So what a person who sits in a room says to himself, well, if I speak my mind, I could be disapproved of. On the other hand, I could be rewarded. So I need to figure out which is more important for me to pursue, reward or avoid disapproval. So I'll either accept the disapproval and accept myself, or I will accept that I don't want to take the calculated risk of the disapproval because the penalties are too great. The reward is too little. So the governor, to use that word, interesting word, right, is concern, which is a healthy negative emotion because concern gets us to start self-helping behavior and stop self-defeating behavior or inhibit it.
Got it. Huh.
Concern is a really good emotion. It's my favorite, one of my favorite negatives.
Well, yeah, and it also sounds like is an excessive emotion that could result in a form of fatalism. I might as well keep going. I'm so bad. I'm just going to keep going in this behavior. I give up. Concern seems a little more empowering. Like, okay, what do I got to do? I'm not done. I can change this. I'll do my best to fix this or make restitution. Anyway, that's how I'm taking it. It seems like there are emotions that are self-defeating in the sense that, and I think Ellis talks about or writes about this, that if you're a failure, then you're just going to give up. By the way, we have jumped to the more deeper end of the pool, and I didn't want to do that. It was my fault. My apologies.
You're so eager to get into it that you.
So let's back up because I want to talk about Albert Ellis and your background. You tell us about Albert Ellis. He's the bona fide, and correct me where I'm wrong here, bona fide originator, if you will, or along with Beck, on cognitive behavioral therapy. Is that right?
I would argue that Ellis really, if you know your history, and Beck didn't really write about cognitive therapy or publish anything till 1963. By that point, Ellis had published 3 major works. A major article in 58, a self-help book that sold millions of copies.
I wasn't even going to bring up Beck. His name seems to be associated when you.
Yeah. Well, I think Dr. Beck made a tremendous contribution to the research.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
And the theoretical literature as well. But I think that you need to know the history to really understand. I would say that Ellis really, few people know that Ellis predates in a very 3 major publications that predates Beck's work on cognitive therapy. So I would say, he creates this thing, this paradigm shift. He moves the Titanic in a different direction.
Yeah.
away from psychoanalysis or away from non-directive therapy, a la Carl Rogers, and towards emphasizing cognition and behavior change and efficiency and things like that.
And you trained with him, is that right? Or were you a student or?
I worked with Albert Ellis for years, first as a pre-intern trainee. Albert was really good about allowing people to sit in on supervision. And so I did that before I even had my turn to see cases, because I worked at the Institute. Then when it was my turn in graduate school to get to doing internships, they accepted me because they knew that I was very interested in REBT, and I worked in formal training for 3 years. Then I was trained as a supervisor. Then I was on the staff. And so I worked with Albert for a number of years, over 5, maybe 6 or 7, maybe 7 probably. And I knew him well. I was formally trained by him after having been Aaron Beck's scribe at the University of Pennsylvania. When I was an undergraduate, I worked at the Center for Cognitive Therapy as a person who worked in the data room. And when they needed somebody to sit next to Dr. Beck and copy every word he wrote, I was that person. And I did that for well over a year and a half,
Wow,
maybe 2. And I learned a lot about cognitive therapy because he was doing his weekly case supervision with people now are very prominent names in the field, such as his daughter, Judy Beck. I remember the day he introduced her. Bob Leahy, Wendy Dryden, George Lockwood, and others. And so he wanted everything written down that was said. And I was a really ambitious guy. And then from there, I went to study with Albert Ellis and worked with Al for 7 or so years. And then over 14 years ago, I returned to the University of Pennsylvania and worked again with Beck's group and had a second tour duty, so to speak. After the grant money for that position ran out, I went and worked and continue to this day work in outpatient psychiatry as a practicing clinician. But, I've had exposure to these 2 models, but I've always I haven't been able to shake my affinity for the REBT model, because although they're overlapping, I think that there are clear advantages and strengths to the model.
I was going to talk about that with you. To me, just from my personal experience, what has helped me with REBT is the irrational beliefs. I can more readily trace my disturbances to peg one of those irrational beliefs. Things must go well, or bad things shouldn't happen, or whatever. So first, there's so much here. This is Pandora's box. How was Albert Ellis? What was he like?
He was a lot of fun to work with.
I'm happy to hear that.
He was really a lot of fun to work with. When I walked by the building that was sold, and what follows from that building is in Midtown now. But when I walk by it on the Upper East Side where I live, I just think of I always say to my wife when we walk to Central Park, we had so much fun in that building. We would laugh because humor was part of REBT, and not taking yourself too seriously and teaching people not to take themselves too seriously. It was such a beehive of smart people from around the world coming there to be in residence, meaning be in New York City for a year or 2 or 3. So it was just such an exciting place to be, but we laughed. And Al was so good at helping us overcome our personal problems. So at that point in my life as a graduate student, I had personal problems, emotional problems. And one of the things that Al would do is challenge us in order to be our best psychotherapists, he would say the best REBT therapists are the people who practice what they preached. And so he accepted us unconditionally. And he would show compassion. People would think he was this cold guy, but there was a reason why he kept a certain distance during psychotherapy sessions, because he didn't want to reinforce conditional self-acceptance predicated on therapist approval. But when you got to know the guy, he really cared deeply about helping people. And so he helped me overcome my personal problems. And he did that with a lot of different people. And the other thing that was good was, better to error than be perfectionistic and procrastinate on something. So I could walk in and say, Al, I really screwed up. Here's what happened. And it'd be like, all right, well, we'll deal with it. But if you walked in there and said, Al, I know I promised this, but I couldn't get to it. So he really was against perfectionism. And I think, and that was part of how he related to the people in training.
Was there, for Albert Ellis, how did he arrive at rational emotive behavioral therapy? And when I say arrive, I'm not saying the whole, codex of everything he's created. I mean, just the general concept that, hey, was it Stoicism? Was he reading Stoicism?
He had a tough upbringing. He was neglected as a kid, more or less raised himself. He was the oldest of a couple of children, three. And he spent a lot of time in the hospital for nephritis. I think it was a kidney problem. But what happened was he was trained, he was enamored by philosophy, and he became like a local legend where people would, and he was just known to be this really smart guy. And he developed a practice called the LAMP Institute, which was an acronym for Love and Marriage Problems Institute. And people would come to him, and this is back in the late 40s, early 50s, and very early 50s, or let's say mid 40s. And if you were cheating on your wife or you were divorced, these were really bad. These were really emotionally laden things. And he would help people get past some of these problems at the LAMP Institute. He got his PhD and got trained in psychoanalysis. And then he started a practice in psychoanalysis, and he had two practices. He kept his LAMP Institute going, and he had this, and these people would come in once a week, sit up, and he would give them ideas like, you don't have to upset yourself, and your partner doesn't have to be exactly, what you want in life. You don't have to be miserable about it. You can talk with them and work things out. And he had this other practice where people would lay on the couch and he would do psychoanalysis. And as he said it, these people were going nowhere fast, the people lying on the couch. And eventually
he was running infield A/B tests, experimenting with two modalities. Is that?
Yes, simultaneously had two modalities going, one and very different. Right. One where people are coming in multiple times a week, lying on the couch, and he's saying nothing but being a psychoanalyst, intervening very little. And
tell me, how does that make you feel? Yeah.
Yeah. And interpreting the resistance and analyzing dreams. And in the other practice, he's being active directive like REBT. So REBT really grew out of the focus on interpersonal relationships. And then eventually he saw that he just abandoned the psychoanalytical approach because he says these people are going nowhere fast. And so in 56, he goes to the American Psychological Association and says, look, thoughts and feelings and behaviors are interrelated, and we need to address people's thinking. And here are the attitudes and beliefs that I think are at the core of disturbance. And he outlined, I think, 12 irrational attitudes, like things like, people are wicked when they do bad things. I need the love and approval of significant others. Subsequent to that 56 address in Chicago at American Psychological Association, people ridiculed him. And he faced a lot of resistance because the analysts said, you're going to injure people. You're going to hurt them. And he, with his self-acceptance, stood up to them, debated them, and then published that in 1958 as an article titled Rational Therapy. Then in 61, he published the new guide to rational living, which is still reads to this day as a useful book.
Yeah, and
then in 62, Reason and Emotion in Psychotherapy, which was actually more oriented towards a professional audience. And by this point, he's doing REBT because he's saying, look, I can help people more efficiently. I can help them with a wide variety of problems, and I can help them learn to help themselves long after therapy. And so why don't I just fall back on these philosophical ideas, partly that I learned through the Stoics. He would often say he welded the Stoic ideas to behavior therapy techniques, such as exposure therapy, as you cited. So it was an interaction between he would encourage people to penalize themselves like a behavior therapist might. And so REBT was created in a private practice in the rough and tumble streets of Manhattan, where people came in with multiple diagnoses and asked for help. Very different than Beck's cognitive therapy that grew up in a clinical laboratory.
where people were carefully selected based upon diagnostic criteria. Let me go back also and define terms. REBT is a distinct form of cognitive behavior therapy. It's a mistake that's commonly made. CBT is an umbrella term. Under that term come multiple it's a therapeutic tradition of examining thoughts and emphasizing the power of thoughts and behavior, modifying behaviors. And under that comes REBT. Under that comes Beck's cognitive therapy. Underneath that umbrella term comes acceptance and commitment therapy and dialectical behavior therapy. Now, people started calling Beck's therapy because of his prominence in generating all these research studies and probably America's bias towards randomized controlled clinical trials to start saying, well, CBT is Beck's cognitive therapy. They really are muddying the waters. And I don't think he really did much to correct that. Beck did. I think it would have been better if he said, well, this is one cognitive behavioral approach amongst others, REBT being one of them, my therapy being one of them. And these are both cognitive behavior therapies.
So let's see if we can help somebody or help some people by talking about this. Give me what is distinctive about REBT as to it stands alone or fairly alone or maybe stands out from the other type of therapies. My initial guess is what I see, but you tell me if I'm right or wrong, is this foundational irrational beliefs. You mentioned, I think, 11 of them or whatever number they are. But let me let you speak to it as the expert here.
Well, it turns out that the model got refined over his 60-year clinical career. And in the end, he ended up emphasizing, three primary irrational attitudes. I have to do perfectly well and have certain desirable traits. You have to treat me nicely, fairly, and the world has to be a lovely place to live in, predictable and safe and nice. And then from that comes certain derivative attitudes like it's awful, it's unbearable, or life is totally bad if it's not good. You're totally bad if you're not good, or I'm totally bad if I'm not good. So there's three primary attitudes and three derivatives, awfulizing attitudes of unbearability and devaluation of self, others, and life. Now,
wait a minute. Just to be clear for everybody listening, these are irrational beliefs. These beliefs are the core of problems, emotional problems.
Yes.
Yep.
The three primary, the three ones. But
I must do well. Others must treat me well. I don't remember the third.
Life has to be easy.
Life has to be easy. I just want to say, just that kind of heuristic, three things, is so beneficial because when you're in the shit, to recall three things is easy versus a whole checklist of what do you have to do to dispute thoughts.
But here's the thing, right? You asked what's the big difference. REBT is more than those four ideas, right? REBT, in my view, is a system of ideas for helping us get through life. It's a well-constructed system of ideas. And depending on how you define a philosophy, and I wrote about this in a professional book called New Directions in Rational Emotive Behavior Therapy, arguing it's a philosophy of life. And one of your previous guests said, well, it's weak in metaphysics, Massimo Pilucci. And I would agree with his criticism. Doesn't really have a lot to say about metaphysics, but it certainly has a lot to say about ethics. And one of the most stringent definitions of philosophy of life is that philosophy of life has a metaphysics and ethics, but that's definitional. REBT is a system of ideas that actually not only helps us over emotional disturbance, but also then to how to orient ourselves in the world. And I'll go into that because it has an image of a healthy human. Now, comparing that, so it's a system of ideas, depending on how you define it, a philosophy of life, and a psychotherapy that follows from that system of ideas. If you look at Beck's cognitive therapy, I would argue it is a psychotherapeutic system. It was derived in a laboratory for different diagnostic groups. And it does have something that sticks across those groups, the cognitive model, but it is really not, and he would definitely not ever, because it wanted to be a philosophy of life. It's a psychotherapy based upon an information processing model, and it's empirically derived. Beck once said at his birthday, I don't have to be right, but I don't want to be wrong. And I think what he was trying to say, I was thinking about this last night.
We're talking about Beck now. We're talking about
Beck. Yeah.
Okay.
Beck says, I don't have to be right, but I don't want to be wrong. I think what really Beck was really a clinical scientist who wanted to see the data. And so he created a model that was testable, protocol driven, and that would enable him to find support for the model. Where Ellis didn't grow up in academia. He cultivated his model in the rough and tumble streets of Manhattan, where people came in with multiple diagnoses. He tried to help them. And so REBT began to be developed from a very practical way. You know, what came in the door? How do we help this person?
What worked? What didn't? All right.
Yeah. And the thing is, over Al's career, it's estimated he saw 180,000 hours, 180,000 hours of face-to-face clinical time. In other words, he was seeing people from the dawn to dusk and writing on Sunday. He was refining the system of ideas. But he was really, when I think about being in residence with him, he was really like a philosopher, and other people from around the world came to study with his philosopher.
Did he like that mantle? Was he trying to develop a philosophy? Was he aware that's where he was headed?
I would think he would say, I'm developing a philosophically based psychotherapy, but I think he would not have a problem with saying, depending upon how you define philosophy, yeah, this is a philosophy. I think he didn't write enough in that area, but I think that he would have no problem to say, look, I have a set of ideas that I think go beyond psychotherapy that help people maximize pleasure, minimize pain, figure out what they're going to do with their lives, because you find yourself on this earth for a finite period of time and you're essentially given the existential choice. What am I going to do with my life? How am I going to use this resource called living? And so I think he would have no problem at all to say it's more than a psychotherapy, but he never spoke about it being a philosophy as far as I can recall. And he would say it's philosophically based upon philosophical ideas, but therapy was the way he would present it.
What is that? What is the philosophy of life?
It's a philosophy of unconditional self-acceptance, where I start with the premise that I'm a fallible human, no better than anyone else. And I have time on my hands, and I could do with that time whatever I want. And I probably will do some good things as I pursue my goals, and some bad things. It's a philosophy of unconditional other acceptance. So we have the philosophy of REBT incorporates the philosophy of unconditional other acceptance with responsibility. I'm responsible for my actions. So if I break laws, I can't say to a judge, hey, judge, I have unconditional self-acceptance. Albert Ellis taught it to me. He'll say, yeah, go to your cell and think about that for the next 30 years because you ran some guy over when you were drunk. You killed somebody, innocent person. That's called manslaughter in this society. You could have unconditional self-acceptance. You're still responsible for your behavior. It's a philosophy of unconditional life acceptance that things don't have to happen in life. As much as we'd like life to be a certain way, it doesn't have to be according to Larry's master plan or Walter's master plan. Life is the way it is. And it's a mix of good and bad and a lot of neutral things too. But to rate the whole person, the only valid way you could possibly do it is as follows. Be around at birth, understand the goals of that organism every day, score its behaviors every day till the day they die, and then conclude at the end that you've done this thorough inventory of everything they've ever done. You've taken into account all mitigating circumstances and reached the conclusion that they're all bad because there's no more behavior to come. Another way to look at unconditional self-acceptance is that it's conditional self-acceptance, which is what Beck's therapy teaches, or the philosophy of conditional self-esteem. Conditionals are definitions. They're definition. Well, who's cornered the truth? Is there absolute truth? Or is it reasonable people can disagree about things, and maybe there are just fallible humans that are ever prone, complex, and they do things. And it's hard enough to decide on whether what they've done is good or bad, let alone whether their essence is good or bad. And what utility do you get out of calling a person bad other than anger? And I don't even know if unhealthy anger is all that good because it blinds you. Why not just talk about behavior, empirical behavior? He does bad things empirically. We could agree on that. And now we'll evaluate what we do about his empirically observed bad behavior.
Okay. So with that said, did you pretty much encapsulate the philosophy, or is there anything else to it?
I think we have more to it. I think that the philosophy of REBT would argue that as part of unconditional life acceptance, we recognize that we live, utopias don't exist, perfect humans don't exist, and that it's just a series of trade-offs that we have to evaluate. That in terms of the self-acceptance, that we live in a world where calculated risk-taking is part of the human condition, and that our image of a healthy human is a person who can engage in it and take calculated risks, not foolhardy ones. But probably the most important thing for me is what Albert called vitally absorbing interests, and what I call having a mission in life. So my mission is to disseminate these powerful ideas, because REBT is an endangered species, that Beck's cognitive behavior therapy and these other more prominent ideas, therapies like ACT and DBT, have dominated the professional discourse. And yet REBT, I think, is a powerful system of ideas. And it brings me great pleasure to have an opportunity to talk about it. So my mission is to do it on Saturday mornings, where I do these weekly demonstrations for the past 200 and almost 75 weeks now, where today we had 181 people, where I disseminate these ideas by taking a volunteer from the audience somewhere in the world and doing a demonstration. I talk to them about a real problem, no role playing. And I show them how to apply these powerful philosophical ideas. And then at the end, I take some questions and comments and criticisms from the audience. So I think the idea of not only being disturbed and overcoming emotional and behavioral disturbance, but also maximizing pleasure and meaning is part of REBT. Martin Seligman, the father of positive psychology, called Albert Ellis probably the grandfather of the positive psychology movement. And that's because Seligman knew that Ellis talked about vitally absorbing interests, and that we wanted people to go beyond emotional disturbance, but actually have a ball in life. Ellis would argue that having an effing ball in life was really the best way to live your life. Figure out how to have fun and then do it. Do it in a responsible way, because you live in a social group. And my fun had better not strip you of your personal rights.
How would REBT, or how would you address someone coming in with a problem of, I don't know what to do with my life? Or let's say I just left a job, or I don't know, disillusioned with work. Now I have some freedom here, but I don't know what to do with my life. How do I find direction? What have you? Are you saying that REBT can address that, and does it?
Absolutely. Yeah, sure it can. And
is there a shorthand you can give me without? Sorry.
Yeah. I'll give you one word. Experiment.
I like that. Experiment. Okay.
Yeah. So you know what? Have you ever tried your hand at writing code? Have you ever tried your hand at, first of all, I said writing code, but let's back up. What have you ever fantasized about doing that you think might be fun? Go and try to do it. Now you might say, well, the startup, the barriers to entry are too high. Well, now you need philosophical acceptance. Either you find a way to invest and circumvent those barriers to entry, or you find something that you can do and experiment. So you go down the list, but you don't whine about the fact that there are barriers to entry. You figure out either how to circumvent the barriers or do something that has barriers that you can hop over. So like in my next life, Larry, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to design women's dresses. I like color. I like fabrics. I like looking at the world. I like I would want to design beautiful dresses if I weren't a psychologist. I'd do them for women.
All right.
That's I'm having too much fun doing this. So I'm not going to experiment with going to the school of fashion and learning how to work with fabrics.
So figure out, you have some ideas of things that you'd want to do or like to do, experiment, go.
And accept that you may fail. There's no guarantee you're going to succeed. And if you do, accept yourself when you fail. Work your butt off to circumvent the barriers and be successful. See how it goes. And when you get tired of trying, then try something else.
So you said something very interesting. Again, you said philosophical acceptance. I like that because a lot of what I read in Rational Emotive Behavioral Therapy, to me, helps me accept what's going on in my life by saying, look, things don't have to go your way. Things may not. This is the world. And those truths, that insight is like, oh, of course. And then dealing with the shoulds. This should have happened. This shouldn't have happened. Those words are, what does he call it? Is he called it shoulding yourself? Or
yeah, well, he would say, shoulding, but or masturbation is a humorous way of conveying the idea, demanding this, dogmatic thinking.
But that's philosophical acceptance, right? That's what you.
Well, we actually define philosophical acceptance, which I can take a minute to do if you'd like.
Please. Because to me, acceptance is a huge part of mitigating emotional disturbance, or at least getting over something. But
yeah. So it's an acknowledgement of a negative state of affairs. Our definition begins with acceptance incorporates an acknowledgement of a negative state of affairs, an acknowledgement that we may not understand all the conditions that give rise such that negative state of affairs exists, but we acknowledge that all the conditions are in existence in the moment for that negative state of affairs to exist. We acknowledge that negative state of affairs is dispreferred to our values. Our acceptance definition incorporates the idea that no matter how dispreferred that negative state of affairs may be, it is not unbearable. And unbearable meaning it will kill us. It may be highly dispreferred. We acknowledge that although it may be highly dispreferred, it's not awful because there can be something worse still than the current negative state of affairs. We finally incorporate into this definition, it's a very robust definition, that we make an attempt to change the negative state of affairs if they can be changed. We make a decision whether or not we're going to try to do that because we might not know whether they're changeable, and we may decide to change them or not. And if we choose not to, or they're not changeable, then we acknowledge that we're able to emotionally move on. In other words, live happily with them, not necessarily as happily as we would if they didn't exist. So let's assume a loved one dies, right? We might say to ourselves, well, that's really bad. And all the conditions were right for them to cease to live. They had a certain cancer and it's really, really, really bad. Dispreferred. I love this person. And I don't think I can go on. But you know what? Each moment that I think I can't go on, I seem to keep on going on. So I am really living through this nightmare. I'm bearing it. It's not easy to bear. And well, now I'll bear it. And then after a period of time, I may even elect, since I can't bring them back to life, to either do something in their honor, like, gather money for leukemia society, or maybe also go find another lover. Because after all, I want to live well, despite having this huge adversity occur in my life.
So I've had Dr. David Burns, who wrote Feeling Good, Stephen Hayes. And so I've had a lot of psychologists on, and I've always kind of tack on the conversation for the audience to hopefully hit a broad swipe of some helpful information. Is there one or two things that you would offer as a powerful example of REBT that a lot of people listening here could use?
What's in short supply in our society, in my view, is emotional responsibility for disturbance. We're quick to blame other people for our disturbance. our anger. So what's in short supply is intolerance, which emanates from saying, I know what's right and you have to agree with me. And if you don't agree with me, you're pissing me off. So now you have a couple of problems there. You have this anti-empirical idea that they're pissing you off, which they aren't. They're doing what they're doing and you're pissing yourself off and you can't see it. So the principle of emotional responsibility is this idea that we disturb ourselves when things happen that are dispreferred. The second thing I would argue is that as soon as people adopt the principle of emotional responsibility, they have much more they have healthy negative emotions. They're annoyed, they're disappointed, and then they can strategically and creatively engage in activism, political activism, activity aimed at trying to change what they don't like. The first thing is you need to acknowledge that you anger yourself, you depress yourself. The second thing I think would be an idea that would broadly apply to people is that when you define your human value, if you went out on Park Avenue outside my office and said to 100 people going by, are you a good person, a bad person, or neither? Larry, let's do a thought experiment. What would you think most of those 100 people would say? What would be the majority response? I'm a good person, I'm a bad person, or neither?
Some form of neither. I would think they would say, yeah, I'm okay.
That's saying I'm a good person.
Oh, is it okay? All right. So that's what I think. Now, they may not believe that. They may believe the opposite, but I don't think they would tell you or me.
Okay. Well, assuming that then that they, either way, whether they believe that they are or they believe that they're not, that's the problem. So what I'm saying is for 80% of the audience, maybe 99% of the audience, this idea from REBT will apply. Stop defining your human value yourself and only work on identifying what you do well and what you do poorly, what your good traits are, characteristics, and what your bad traits are and characteristics. When you do that, you open the door to the possibility of self-acceptance, and that is game-changing. It is game-changing because you are going to go to your deathbed, and as am I, with certain negative characteristics that haven't been altered, certain behaviors that you're not so happy about having engaged in, certain failures that have occurred despite your best efforts. When you define yourself in terms of these things, you have a sense of inadequacy that is burdensome. So I would be asking people to put down that sense of inadequacy, and in letting it down, they'd open the door to the fresh air, which would be the scent of unconditional self-acceptance. Powerful idea.
Well, that is powerful. That's great. How much do you think the low frustration tolerance plays in negative emotions with people?
Huge. In fact, that's a big difference between Beck's cognitive therapy and REBT. Insofar as we see, Ellis wrote about two fundamental human disturbances: ego disturbance and what he called discomfort disturbance. Initially, he called it intolerance or low frustration tolerance. Then he changed it to discomfort disturbance. And essentially what we're saying there is he called it I can't stand it-itis. So when people get disturbed, much of the time they're either saying you're a bad person and condemning you and then saying I can't stand it, or they're condemning themselves and saying I'm a bad person. Ego disturbance is where I say to myself I'm a bad person, or I say to myself I'm a great person. That's ego disturbance too, because what goes up does fall.
Inflating. The balloon is filled, but it's going to run out. Yeah.
Yeah. So ego disturbance is where you're rating yourself and you're setting yourself up for emotional problems as a function of your global self-rating. The second disturbance is discomfort disturbance, which my colleague Wendy Dryden calls non-ego disturbance. In other words, everything else tends to be non-ego, which means which involves I can't stand what I don't like. So if I don't like it, I can't stand it. So what are the things that we don't like? First of all, we don't like blood, sweat, and tears. So we don't like our internal experience. Now, the people in the dialectical behavior therapy world co-opted this idea and called it distress intolerance. But we were talking about discomfort, anxiety, long before Marsha Linehan and her DBT came onto the scene. So what we're saying with non-ego disturbance, it can be directed in, I can't stand it, in two directions. It's unbearable. I can't stand it. It can be either internal, like, hey, I'm anxious. I can't stand it. Or I'm so tense. I can't stand it. Or I'm so depressed. I can't stand it. Or it could be put out there. I can't stand Trump, or I can't stand his policies, or I can't stand traffic. I can't stand graffiti. I can't stand injustice. So the non-ego, I can't stand it disturbance can be directed internally to your emotional experience, or even somatic feelings like I can't stand the pain in my legs when I get tired, or my back pain, or I can't stand injustice, or I can't stand traffic. I can't stand being insulted. So this is a huge categorization that can be really useful for people. They could just simply ask themselves, hey, am I downing myself and am I disturbing myself because my ego is now tied to my performance? Or am I saying something like, I can't stand what this person's doing, and getting myself into a hot, lathered anger because of that?
Yeah, I read somewhere that the road to success is paved with frustration. And the only way you're going to get there or make it through is dealing with frustrations. That's
tolerating
what you sign
it.
up for. Yeah.
And withstanding it and doing your thing despite.
It's a hallmark of successful people is dealing with
when you care about something, you're going to get frustrated. So says David Burns. I would agree with that, right? Yeah. It reflects the fact that I care about something. I'm frustrated. I don't get frustrated about things I don't care about. Okay, fine. But beyond that, right, we need to tolerate it in order to pursue the mission. If you want to start something, if you're going to be an entrepreneur, right, you got to tolerate defeats, people saying it won't work, laughing at you, failing, revising your plan, and continuing to try a new idea. And so learn by failing. I think, has it right.
Yeah, I interviewed a long time ago someone who wrote a book, Fail Fast and Fail Forward type of, I think the title was something like that. But his whole idea was the quicker you fail, the quicker you're going to get to really what you're trying to do.
Think about it informationally. The quality of information is higher when you fail because you learn,
that's
you learn more than when you succeed.
There's more data points.
But you send me a card. You're very thoughtful. I think that's very cool that you do this. This card I'm holding up for the audience listening. REBT teaches you practical ideas, and there are 8 ideas on this card. And there were things in the card, on the card, the points. Some of them I wanted to talk about. And some of these, we have touched on them a little bit, but I want to really hone down on them. How long have you been doing this, sending this card?
Well, I must admit that it's not my idea. Albert had a card very similar to this that was a collector's item. He had on the front side 3 ideas that were self-helping, and on the back side 3 ideas that were self-defeating. And if my memory serves me correctly, I don't have one available. I looked at those cards and I said, well, maybe it'd be better to put on both sides the ideas that I want to put forth. So I modified it, but it was his idea.
Look, I think every therapist should have some version of this. So anyway, I want to talk about emotional responsibility. Hold yourself responsible for your reaction to adversity. Change what is changeable and accept the unchangeable. I'm sure there's people listening who have been triggered by something that is unjust, let's say objectively so. I'm not going to have an example, or a work situation, whatever, somebody treats them poorly. And even if we just saw a video recording, we would agree it was treated poorly. And they would be super angry or just emotionally triggered related to their thoughts about that particular event. So someone may say, you are kind of blaming the victim, maybe, or my emotions are justified. And by the way, those 2 ideas in my mind you can hold both of them as true. What would you say to that person?
I would say they don't understand the concept that's being put forth. I'm not blaming anybody. I'm pointing out what you're responsible for and what is beyond your domain of responsibility. So when someone does something or says something that's insulting, I once had a guy in graduate school spit in my face. I was sitting on a jukebox and he was collecting beer from other people's pitchers. And I stupidly grabbed his wrist and said to him, "That's not yours." And he was a big guy and he spit on my face. And it was a week before I defended my dissertation and I had a split second to defend my honor or not. What was I responsible for? My reaction to his insulting behavior. What was I not responsible for? Him spitting in my face. So what was I responsible for? My thinking, my attitude towards his insulting behavior. I wasn't responsible for his behavior, although I have to say it was a little provocative for me to grab his wrist, even though he knew what he was doing. That was not a good behavior on my part. But I quickly recovered and saw the error of my ways and didn't make two mistakes. Because if I had gotten into a fight with him, who knows whether I even show up for my dissertation defense. So what we're saying in REBT is that people do really nasty things to each other. The question is if you're going to make it through the world, you could either be a prisoner of circumstances or you can empower yourself by looking for the variables that are under your influence and leveraging those variables. So the attitude we have is within our influence. Now, that attitude doesn't have to be unrealistic. I could say, I don't like it when people spit in my face. That's very realistic. However, when they do that, I have options. I can say they must not do this and then throw a punch and see where that goes. Or I could say, I don't like this, but sadly, the universe allows people to do very nasty things to each other. I think it's time for me to leave and accept that that's what's in my long-term best interest, which is what I did. And I'm so glad that event happened because I take responsibility for me wrongly grabbing this fella's wrist. But he was a huge guy. He would have beat me up badly before the bouncers would have got to where we were in the bar. And I have a great story that really conveys responsibility for what's within our domain of influence. You can't control other people and what they do, but you can control how you react to them. And that's what this is about. I'm not blaming anybody. I'm just holding people responsible for what's within their domain of influence.
Yeah. So in that particular case, it was your feelings about what he was doing was your responsibility, not what he was doing, but how you felt about it. It was
and
within
my thinking too. And my thinking.
And your thinking, right. Your feeling kind of follows the thinking or in parallel.
Exactly.
So I tend to think of, I've used this example before. It's probably a very poor example, but let's say I get a flat tire. I'm late to a meeting. I get a flat tire. And my automatic reaction, let's say the confluence of factors is pissed off. Flat tire, gonna be late. Damn it. And very frustrated, just mad. And I'm changing the tire and I'm in this horrible mood. Now, there is not a wire from the flat tire that gets plugged into my brain where the flat tire sets off an emotional trigger in my brain that I feel and it floods me and I get angry. So there's not that connection. Okay. I have a feeling or thought about the flat tire, maybe prior stuff going to my mind. So I am responsible for the emotion that I'm feeling about the flat tire. The flat tire didn't cause my emotional mood. I did because of my thinking around the flat tire. Is that overly simplistic? But it's like there's...
In fact,
okay.
there was your attitude triggered your emotional response. The thing that people also have to understand is that because we make a distinction between healthy emotions and unhealthy emotions, both being negative, if you are feeling appropriately annoyed or sad or disappointed or concerned, then you could say, the adversity is making a contribution to that sadness or that concern that I'll be late for this important meeting or this disappointment or annoyance or frustration, whatever you want to call that healthy emotion, which acknowledges the adversity. On the other hand, you could say you can get rageful, kick the tire, break your foot. You could start crying and get upset. well, you're also triggering that reaction. So if there's a trigger, it's your attitude triggering one emotion or the other, a healthy one or an unhealthy one, both being negative. So that makes people understand this.
Right. And by the way, I'm not saying my reaction in this case of the tire is wrong or right. That's not the judgment. I'm saying I am the custodian of me and my brain and my emotions. And this is where it's happening. And I am ginning it up. Okay. Whether that's good or bad. So I'll give you an example because I think we touched on this before. Trump just did something I thought was abhorrent the other day. Just horrible. I got very upset, very mad. And I was okay with my reaction, but I knew it was my reaction. Okay. And I wasn't blaming Trump for how I felt about his behavior. I knew it was my thinking, my emotion, but I approved it. You know what I mean? I was like, okay, to me, it was an appropriate reaction to what I saw was unjust or undignified, whatever the interpretation.
I would say it's not so much the interpretation that gets us upset. It's the demand that we hold, the rigid attitude towards the interpretation. So I won't speak for you. I'll speak. Mr. Trump were to do something that I consider to be unpresidential and mean-spirited, that would be an interpretation of his behavior, because another person could say Mr. Trump wasn't doing something that was unpresidential. But what gets us angry is a deeper level cognition, the attitude that Mr. Trump absolutely must not say such things. And I can't bear when he does, or it's the end of the world, or he's a bad person for doing that. So it's that rigid and extreme attitude that really triggers. It's not the interpretation. The inference that something bad has been done contributes. That's A, adversity. And most cognitive behavior therapies will question that inference and try to reframe it. I never use the word reframing because to me, lipstick on a pig is still a pig. So what I'm doing is saying, well, why shouldn't pigs exist? People say things that are really hurtful. And that's sadly the case. So I wish they didn't. I wish our presidents were more presidential, but sadly they're not. And what are you going to do?
And we touched on, in fact, we went into great detail on number 3, unconditional self and other acceptance. I thought that was very good. 4 and 5, I want to talk about because it relates to what you just said. So number 4 is tolerance of life. Perfection and utopias don't exist. Everything changes. Adopt realistic attitudes toward adversity. View happiness as a choice. And then 5, uncertainty, tolerance. Only probability, not certainty exists. Take calculated risk, avoid foolhardy ones, and do what is best in the long run. So tolerance of life, again, you touched on this. Everything changes. Perfection doesn't exist. It says view happiness as a choice. Can you elaborate on that? So this is where I struggle. On the face of it, if I'm in a bad mood, it seems very difficult, not impossible for me just, okay, switch. Right now I'm sad. I'm going to choose to be happy. When you say happiness is a choice, what do you mean?
What I mean is that in order to allow happiness to come over oneself, one has to get rid of their demand that life be easy, that there be ideal circumstances in our lives, that it be fair. When we hold the attitude, when we put demands on life and say life should be fair or life should not be so hard, we are not creating the psychological environment for happiness to evolve. But if you think about it, like people say, you should count your blessings every day. You can count your blessings, but still say, but I should have more blessings. And so unless you uproot this demand that life be a certain way, how are you going to be happy? And so what we say in REBT is you got to target the attitudes that make us miserable in a challenging world, because life is one adversity after another from cradle to the grave. And once you say, I don't like that, but that's the world, that's life, that's the way we live, that's the world we live in. Now you have a flexible attitude towards these never-ending adversities. And then you're in a better position to say, yeah, I don't like the unfairness of life, but what do I have going for me? Or what What can I still be grateful about and take some happiness in?
Yeah, there's an aspect of that happiness as a choice that if I flip it, works better for me. For example, unhappiness is a choice. In other words, if I say unhappiness is a choice, let's say I'm going on vacation, it's going to rain. I see it's raining and I was hoping for sunshine. I'm on the beach. I can accept that. So I'm unhappy about it, right? Pay a lot of money for the beach view, whatever. And I had all these expectations. So I can cling to that as it rains and be miserable. Or I can decide to let that go and accept the rain and say, okay, how long am I going to be miserable? Okay, it's already raining. Am I going to accept this, fight this, or let it go? And so to me, it seems it's more helpful to me to go, okay, look, this misery is now I'm choosing to stay mad, and that's not going to change anything. So let that go.
Your language might be better than mine. Maybe the next iteration is called, I'll modify it to view misery as a choice and strive for happiness. That might be better. It's very hard to make this card because you really have so much space. You don't want to make it too.
Oh, yeah.
But the point, I think your point's well taken. But, you could even still stay with view happiness as a choice. So, Larry, God forbid, but let me put a scenario in your head. You book a vacation, it's raining, and guess what? You're miserable. And then you go, well, I'm not going to be miserable. If you learned that either you or your wife are going to die a month later and this would be your last vacation, you might be capable of being happy, even in a circumstance where it's raining. What we're saying in REBT is that we largely construct our emotional experience. And it's important that people see the active, constructive process that we play.
Not only what helps me is to reflect how miserable am I going to make myself? How unhappy do I have to be?
Yeah, but you see, when you ask the first question about how unhappy do you have to be, we're putting forth a different position. That we're really not trying to have people lower their negative emotion. We're actually trying to help them have appropriate emotions that are negative. And some of them can be quite strong. So what we're going to argue is that when there's a threat to your well-being, or you suffer a great loss, one or the other, the adversity and the value judgment and what is at stake will dictate the strength of your emotion. But the question becomes, do you feel strong concern and say, wow, this is unfortunate? So what we're saying is that when the threat is a high level value to something you deeply value, the degree of concern you feel is going to be strong. And you don't want to lower the degree of concern. What you want to do is make sure it's not anxiety, because the unhealthy negative emotions of anxiety, panic are rooted in, oh my God, this must not happen and it's awful. The healthy negative emotion of concern is rooted in, I don't want this sort of thing to happen. So we're saying that healthy attitudes will lead you to qualitatively different emotions than unhealthy attitudes. Now, this is different than most cognitive behavior therapists. Most of them want to reduce your level of upset. And so like Beck's cognitive therapy tends to do that. They'll give you a depression score and say, oh, your Beck depression inventory was 30 at the beginning of treatment, and now it's 10 or 5. You've reduced your degree of depressive symptomatology, where we want people to have strong sadness when they lose a friend that was a close friend or a relative. That's sorrow, and strong sorrow is appropriate. So it's not just the intensity variable, it's the quality of the emotion that determines whether it's healthy or unhealthy, and then the behavioral stuff that goes along with it.
Number 7, long-term hedonism. Frustration and discomfort are difficult to bear, not unbearable. Tolerate. I'm marrying to a degree the uncertainty tolerance and the long-term hedonism, but just because from
they
a
can be
standpoint of
married,
tolerance.
they can be related. Yeah, these ideas play off each other.
Yeah, so let me take a stab at it. So we're talking about tolerance. Frustration and discomfort are difficult to bear, not unbearable. Tolerate the required effort to achieve your goals. Accept that the easy path often fail us. A couple of things come to mind, and I wanted to bounce this off of you. One, I just like the reset that there's something palliative, I don't know why, when you just accept reality that life can be hard at times, and this is just the way it is. You know what I mean? There's just something about that. But also, I want to talk to you about this idea of bearing, tolerating a negative emotion or mood. Would you say that the goal isn't necessarily to be a positive person who never feels bad, but the goal in REBT is to develop emotional fitness? By that, I mean to be able to hold the weight of a negative mood without it crushing your ability to function.
Yes. And to make that negative emotion healthy, we make a distinction between 9 emotions that are deemed to be healthy and 9 emotions that are unhealthy. So it's not just to bear the emotion and function with it, but to also have healthy emotions that rest upon flexible and non-extreme attitudes towards adversity.
I think, Walter, that to me, this seems very important in that if you're caught up in a very negative mood or flooded or triggered, that's a human thing, but some people will find it or think it's unbearable, right? Oh, I gotta, this is terrible. I'm freaking out. I'm anxious and I'm not, this is too much. Or I don't know what's going to happen in this meeting.
Feeling.
I've got to escape this feeling, which leads to poor behavior, things that can compound the negative emotion. Drug abuse, alcohol, you name it, just avoiding a meeting, avoiding a conversation, and just pushing things down the road where it's going to rise up again.
And people are creatures of habit. So they get into these habit patterns of avoiding uncomfortable circumstances and doing self-defeating behavior to cope with them. And then what happens? They back themselves into a corner in life. I was just talking to a patient about this morning. We're creatures of habit. And this person chronically avoids doing things at home and says it's too hard. And then I with the attitude, I have to feel like doing something in order to do it. And I said, no, you don't have to feel like doing something in order to do it. You could choose to do it because that's in your long-term best interest to get it done. And you can say it's uncomfortable to do now, not unbearable. And because it's worth doing, I'm going to do it now, even though I don't feel like doing it. I don't have to feel like doing it. And you'll begin to dig yourself out. And the more you do this, the more you'll get into the habit pattern of bearing discomfort. And people are creatures of habit.
So do you have any tips or tactics when it comes to this, specifically this emotional fitness, being able to hold the weight of a negative mood? What helps me is tuning into the feeling, like, or at least my body. Do I feel it in my chest, my head? And I just kind of tune it. I kind of tune into it and feel it and say, okay, yeah, this is, I'm feeling heavy. I try not to then have a narrative about that feeling. I just try to not run from the feeling, but be with it. Breathe a little bit, just especially when I'm flooded. My father passed away and he had some properties up in North Florida and he had some tenants. And I'm 8 hours away from this, and I was in the process of seeing if the tenants were, was I going to sell the property or what have you. And long story short, somebody had built a meth lab and destroyed the house. I wasn't there to see it, but obviously the payments stopped coming, and I had to hire a lawyer. And then I traveled up there, and I'm still grieving my father at this point, but it took months of, repair, and then in the house, I finally got a hold of the tenant and I had to talk through, the legal aspect of this. I had to bear with this. The mood was going to throw me off into a screaming match, but I had to learn to kind of bear this mood and as calmly carry on to get it done or nothing was going to happen. What do you tell your clients regarding this bearing a negative mood, or is there any instructions that you?
Well, to me, we use this ABC framework over and over again. So I say to somebody, when you have a negative mood, you can put that at position A in the ABC model. It's the adversity. And then your attitude towards your negative mood will determine whether you have emotional disturbance about your negative mood. So, for example, let's take anxiety. People will create panic when they say, well, I'm anxious. I must not be anxious. Oh my God, my anxiety's going through the roof. I have to escape it. So we can make our anxiety worse by holding an attitude that says we can't bear anxiety. Same thing with anger. If we begin to get angry and go, oh my God, I can't stand my anger, we're then probably going to make ourselves more angry. So this ABC framework of REBT is something that we just use over and over again, whether the adversity is something that's out there in reality or whether it's an internal symptom. Even sleeplessness, when people can't fall asleep, you could put sleeplessness at point A and then say, I can't bear lying here and having trouble falling asleep. Or you could say, well, I'll rest. I'm off my feet. I'll just fantasize and not get upset about this internal experience, which is sleeplessness. So people can use the ABC framework of REBT over and over again. That's the technique.
On the specific emotion.
Yes. In other words, most of the time when you present the ABC framework, you say, all right, somebody insulted me. That's the adversity.
Right.
And then I got angry, and my
belief about it.
was my basic attitude or belief was they should respect me. That's one use of that framework. But now you could say, let's take an emotion and put it at A, because people think about their internal experience. When people are getting anxious, they think about it and go, oh my God, I'm having a heart attack. So they begin to think about their anxiety and interpret it as a heart attack. And then they go, oh, I must not have a heart attack. I must not have a heart attack, which gets their anxiety going more. So you can put emotion not only at point C as a result of what's happening out in the world, like somebody insults you, but you could also take your emotional experience and put it at point A and say, people think about their emotional experience. And then they say, I can't bear it, or I have to be calm, or it's awful that I'm depressed, or I must not be depressed. I must not be depressed. And then they get depressed about their depression. And then, so you can use the same framework over and over again to unpack an emotional experience. And Albert was the one who pioneered this. He called it secondary disturbance, where people get angry and then they get angry about having gotten angry. You ruined my day. I can't stand being angry. Or they get depressed about their depression or anxious about their anxiety.
So let's do with depression then. So I'm getting depressed. I'm just overwhelmed with, I don't know,
loss, failure, or undeserved burdens are usually having failure,
depression. I got laid off. Right. So instead of focusing on the event, now help me focus on the emotion.
Well, let's assume you get laid off. That's the first SA. And then you get depressed, right? And then you're lying in bed feeling depressed, and you're aware that you're depressed. And you could either have a healthy attitude towards it and say it's hard to get out of bed, but it's important to do so. I can bear pushing myself out of bed, taking a shower, brushing my teeth, and getting out and looking for a job. Or you could lie in bed saying, oh my God, I'm too depressed to function. I shouldn't be so depressed. Poor me. Life should be easy. And then you get further depressed about your depressed mood and you stay in bed.
Yeah. Compounding the whole situation. The last point here, I have a mission in life: cultivate vitally absorbing interests, significant human involvement to live a meaningful life. Self-evidently, that seems like great advice. But how would you counsel someone who doesn't have a mission? Let's say they got laid off. They're trying to, I don't want to create a concrete example here because that may peg us into, but is a mission so open-ended as to be anything that's constructive in life? Or are you talking about an overarching purpose, or is it as grandiose as that, or is it more
It's whatever you're turned on by. Ellis always argued that our goal was not only to help people pass disturbance, but to enrich their lives, make themselves happy, make themselves enjoy life. So what we're talking, he called it vitally absorbing interest. And he'd say, you experiment to find these interests, and it could be making music, making art, building a business, political activism, building a family. It doesn't matter what it is, whether it's one thing or a bunch of things. It's that you are vitally engaged with life. And I've chosen to borrow that language of vitally absorbing interest, but add having a mission, because my mission is to disseminate these powerful ideas and not have REBT fall out of favor to the point where people don't know about it. So what we're saying is it doesn't matter what it is. It's important to you. It gives your life meaning or happiness. Then that's good enough for me because it's your life. Experiment, find what those things are. Like if I were retired, which probably won't happen anytime soon, hopefully, I would take up learning the piano and acrylic painting. These would probably become vitally absorbing interests, and maybe horseback riding. But I don't have the time for that because I have a really important mission now, which is to disseminate these ideas and use all the technology that's available to us these days to reach the broadest audience with these ideas because they're really believing in them. Now, I have people that are like, I have a patient who's in a nursing, assisted living. And as you age, your options become sometimes a little narrower. You're physically not as fit, say. But I still think you can have vitally absorbing interests. The acquisition of knowledge. Albert used to say that. Just learning Latin, learning algebra or advanced physics or something like that. If your brain's still working, you can throw yourself into life. And so it's interesting. Albert wrote a manuscript when he was 19, The Art of Not Being Unhappy. And he starts off by saying, people can't really prescribe happiness because what makes one person happy won't be what makes another person happy. So for some, it might be political activism. The mission for others might be ecological conservationism. For me, it might be the dissemination of REBT ideas. For my friend George, it's making music. He's retired and he's just he was telling me yesterday that you now can play an instrument in New York and join through the internet musicians in other parts of the world with very little delay. And you could have like a virtual band. One guy's playing bass guitar, one guy's playing regular guitar, he's playing piano, another guy's playing the drums. And this all comes together you throw yourself into life and because what we're saying in REBT is that life is an opportunity to have a ball. That's what Albert used to say. It's an opportunity. So don't squander it. Don't get disturbed, starting off with that. And then as a second step, develop yourself, throw yourself into life, develop your potential, self-actualize.
The fact of the matter is that what we would do is say to people, let's first do the cognitive work that prepares you to think differently. But then you got to do the hard behavioral work and force yourself to live in harmony with that healthy attitude. The Stoics would talk about living in harmony with a certain philosophical stance. And that's what people do. And when you live in harmony with your stance, when you do shame attacks, you develop conviction that you don't need approval. When you do what's hard, you then conclude, I can do what's hard. But you have to force yourself to do what's hard.
That's great.
And, Larry, 90% of the conversations I have all day long, whether it be on Zoom or in my office, is about interpersonal conflict. Yeah, people sometimes come in and say, I'm afraid of going over a bridge, driving over a bridge, the Venezuelan Narrows. It happens once in a blue moon. Every now and then somebody will come in and say, I have obsessive compulsive disorder. But more often than not, what comes in is, I'm really I'm thinking about leaving my husband, or I'm in love with this woman and she doesn't love me. How do I cope with that? The person told me that yesterday. How do I cope with being in love with somebody?
90%, 99%. Or
I would say 95%, 90% of
what's interesting, you said that
interpersonal problems.
Yeah, I had an interview with someone about personality, interpersonal problems. She was less known than a lot of that podcast went through the roof, and I had no idea. And the comments and the feed, it's like, wow, what's going on out there? Yeah.
Here's the next one. What's going on out there? Estrangement. There is an idea that's circulating, I believe, on the internet. The internet catches bad ideas and then spins them. Is this idea that there are toxic parents that should be avoided. And therefore, maybe I should just cut my parents out of my life. And I've had numerous parents come to me saying, I feel so powerless and so helpless and so depressed about the fact that my kid won't talk to me anymore. And I won't ever see my grandchildren or the children they have. And I think the New Yorker had an article on this trend. And I got to tell you something. That's an interpersonal conflict. And I think
it's the end. It's the very end of the interpersonal conflict. Yeah.
And it goes back to the point we talked about earlier about when you said, what would it help 80% of my audience? And I said, emotional responsibility. Stop blaming someone else for making you angry and recognize that they're doing what they're doing. You don't like it. And you're angering yourself about it.
This idea, this is it, in my opinion, because there's a belief, Walter, that an event or thing has a pipeline to my emotional regulation or brain, and this thing is causing me. That's a belief. I really believe people think that somehow this thing.
And let's follow that through. If that's the case, then there's only two options you have. Either avoid cut it out of your life, cut that person out of your life, avoid them, that thing that has a direct impact upon you, avoid it. Whether it be your job, your coworker, your mother, your father, your neighbor, move. Okay? That's one option. The other option is drink yourself silly. Now, both of those options have a clear downside.
I can take pot. What are you talking about? I can.
Yeah, you can smoke all day. Right. Okay. Numb yourself silly. But you know what? That has a clear downside. That model of external events cause me to be disturbed, it handcuffs you because you limit your options. What we do in REBT is say, look, adversity occurs, people will do what they do. You have emotional reactions, and between their actions and your emotional response lies your attitudes, your rigid and extreme attitudes. And if you think that people have to be the way you want them to be and that you can't bear it, you're going to be a prisoner of circumstances. If you say, I want people to treat me nicely, but they don't have to, and I will bear them when it's worth it to me. Now, somebody might say, well, putting up with my mother or father isn't worth it to me. You know what? My view is this. When there's sexual abuse from a parent, when there's severe substance abuse, it might be really prudent to avoid that parent. But when there's everything else, there's great value maybe in learning how to react to them in a healthy way. And when they don't respond to you in the way you would like them to respond, not angering yourself. Because if you start cutting people out of your life, where do you stop? You cut your own kids out of your life when they don't listen to you, your neighbors out of your life, you move, your employer, your wife. Where does the cutting people out of your life stop?
Let's say someone practices the things that you teach, and they're able to bear a difficult relationship. When do you ever recommend, look, life is too short to be dealing with this particular person? However, let's say they're very difficult.
Good question.
You're not saying, you correct me, are you saying that, look, stay where you are, suck it up, you can deal with it? But I mean, let's say, as objectively as we can.
There's a time and place for divorce.
That's go ahead. You know where I'm going. Okay.
Yeah. All right. So
there's no infidelity. This is just two people that are just.
Look, what Albert used to say is first, put up with your partner for 6 months. put up with your boss for 6 months, but use REBT during that 6 months and really get good at taking responsibility what's under your domain of influence, which is your emotional reaction to them. Master that. And then after 6 months, you'll be free of certain cognitive distortions that would have occurred had you thought that people have to treat me the way I want them to treat me. Because the cognitive distortions really emanate from rigid thinking. When you say people have to treat me the way I want them to treat me, then you make faulty inferences about what they may be thinking.
You're off the emotional scale. It amplifies, it exaggerates.
You make bad attributions about what they're up to. So the cognitive distortions that the cognitive therapists talk about really come from deeper level rigid attitudes. And over the years, Beck saw that because he started with the cognitive distortions. Then he migrated in his writing and appended his original model to include deeper level beliefs, right? And REBT started with a discussion of these deeper level beliefs and says, look, learn to give up the idea that people have to do your bidding. Once you get to the point where you can see people for being fallible humans, now you can look and evaluate with annoyance, with disappointment, and the other healthy negative emotions and concern. Divorce is expensive. What's in your long-term best interest? Is it better to throw the baby out with the bathwater? Maybe it is. Or is it better for me to stay in this marriage and make the best of it? So what we do in REBT is first, if we use a framework called the ABC framework, B stands for your basic attitude. It comes between what happens out there and what people do in your emotional response. First, change your basic attitude so that you have healthy negative emotions. Get good at that for a couple of months and then revisit the idea of whether you stay or go. You might just find out that, you know what? It's better to stay. Because you know why? If you go, there's an opportunity cost. You have to find another lover. And what guarantee do you have that the other person is going to be perfect? You're just going to swap problems. Like you leave one job for another. Do you really think you're going to get all coworkers that all pull their weight in any team? Good luck with that one.
When you're at a high emotional, if you're at a 10, you can't make really good decisions. You're clouded, right? You get that down, learn to deal, and then from clarity, you can make that decision. I'm not going to allow you to make that decision when you're freaked out and upset up here. You've got to come down and then take a look.
I would argue that we don't want to lower your emotion. We want to transform it into a healthy negative emotion because you'll make a better decision. They're qualitatively different. The characteristics of qualitatively. So for example, take ice. It's solid. It's H2O. If I melt ice, it becomes liquid, hard to control, but it's still H2O. So what we're doing in REBT is teaching people how to adopt attitudes that enable them to take a self-defeating emotion like anger and despair and turn it into a healthy negative emotion. Now, it's still,
you're not getting rid of
nor am I lessening it.
Yeah.
There are things, Larry, that I can be very strongly concerned about, or I could be deeply saddened by. When my mother passed, I was deeply saddened. My father passed, I was deeply saddened. That's different than I felt when what was the last thing I got deeply saddened by? I'm trying to think. When I learned that I had to move from one apartment to another in Philadelphia, because moving is such a pain in the neck. They wanted to renovate the apartments and they raised the rent through the roof. I was not happy about that. But that sadness or annoyance was radically different than so we're not saying
despondence or despair. Yeah.
Yes. Healthy negative emotions can be strong, but they're predicated on flexible and non-extreme attitudes. I don't want certain obstacles in my life, but sadly, they're going to be a part of my life. That's just too damn bad. That will lead to a strong negative emotion when we're talking about a matter that's very important to me. So the disappointment we feel may be much stronger under some circumstances than in others. But same thing with the unhealthy negative emotions. You could be mildly depressed by saying, I need this person's love. But then you could be like head over heels for somebody who rejects you and then be despondent and say, I absolutely need. You could be desperately in love and desperately depressed about it. So what we're trying to do is teach people to give up that rigidity that leads to these desperate, strong emotions. But they're not always just desperate and strong. They could be mild, but still unhealthy.
Is there?
And we're trying to develop flexible attitudes.
But this is very important. Is there a document out there with the scale? Here's the emotional scale. This is unhealthy. This is the healthy version of that. But
again, there are two scales, right? There are two continua. The healthy continua goes from mild, moderate to strong. And the healthy one is mild, moderate to strong. And we'll say, for example, concern is the healthy alternative to anxiety. Disappointment or sadness is the healthy alternative to depression. Healthy anger is the healthy alternative to unhealthy anger. Now, why do we say unhealthy versus healthy anger? Because there's a absence of good words in the English language for anger that's healthy versus anger that's unhealthy. With anxiety, worry, fear, we have concern. But with anger, we have annoyance as a healthy alternative. But there is some healthy anger is sometimes apropos. Nelson Mandela had healthy anger. I can't say sit in a jail in Peoria and have annoyance. He'll say, yeah, you're in an academic in a tower, right? So that's healthy anger. I want to get out of here. But unhealthy anger is this craziness I find myself in must not exist. I can't bear it. It does exist, and you're incarcerated and bearing it. Maybe it's hard to bear. Don't misunderstand me. It's very hard to bear. But we're really precise in REBT, and the human mind has the capacity for precision. It's a good thing to cultivate.
I want to get these resources and link to them, if you're okay, in the show notes once I publish this, because I'd love to have that myself anyway. This is great. And we got into the meat of things. I was sloppy getting us here. Is there anything, Walter, that we should end with here? Or is there anything you want to say that you weren't able to say that you wanted to?
Well, one thing I think that's important to appreciate is that we really point to how people are biologically predisposed to being disturbed. In Beck's cognitive therapy, I think that there's more of an emphasis on beliefs arising from early learning. And I don't think he moved away from psychoanalysis as much as Albert did, insofar as Albert came along and said, it's human nature to disturb ourselves. Yeah, we have lousy parents. And yeah, our culture teaches us crazy ideas. But you know what? At the end of the day, human nature is flawed. And yes, we have this biological ability, this biological inclination. It's also human to think in a very precise way. But guess what? It's the weaker part of the human mind. The stronger part is the inclination to say things have to be my way. And so I think that when people know that we emphasize that, it kind of helps them begin to accept themselves a little bit.
Go easy on themselves, a little bit.
Yeah, but we're not saying accept yourself because you're biological. I have to think about that.
Well, it's a step toward. I mean, it's the road toward acceptance, right?
We're biologically flawed. And have you known anybody anywhere in your life, anywhere in the world that hasn't gotten disturbed, hasn't changed a behavior only to relapse a little bit, backslide? It seems like there's this biological undertow. We give up smoking and then we relapse. It's like something's pulling us back to our old. Once we do something in an unhealthy way, we relapse, and people across cultures get disturbed. Are
you talking about our predispositions or this evolutionary wiring? Is that what you're talking about? That, our brains are working on jobs that are no longer needed, afraid of the saber tooth in the bushes when we get an email,
partly that, but I'm talking about the tendency for people to think that the environment determines our behavior disturbance.
Got it.
What I'm
You're saying this is innate within us.
We're predisposed to angering ourselves. And once we see that, then we can do something about our crooked thinking and work towards cultivating that other side of ourselves that is capable of reining in this impulse to want to strangle somebody. But we have to acknowledge that, like the yin yang, we have a yin yang, but it's really not 50-50. It's more like 80-20, where the 80%.
That's great. That's great. I use yin and yang a lot. Every front has a back, but that's great that you're giving the 80-20 version.
The rigid and extreme attitudes are the 80, and therapy aims to grow the 20% to flexible, non-extreme attitudes. And here's the thing, life is really unfair, and there are some people that have it 90-10. The yin yang 90-10, not 80-20. And some people are a little luckier and have it 60-40. In terms of biological predisposition towards irrational, rigid thinking, anti-scientific thinking, who's the most prone to think that way and who's the least? That's what it's about. It's about thinking and having fun thinking.
Well, that's a wrap. Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed it, do share it with your friends and on your social platforms. Big thanks to Sam Williams, my audio guy, and the beautiful bumper music you're hearing is Michael Petrovich's Bella Luna. For all my show notes or resource links, visit LarryWeeks.com, and we will talk again soon.